Before this episode begins, I'd like to say that I will be heading to DinoCon UK on the 25th and 26th of July in Birmingham. So if you see me wandering around in my podcast t-shirt, come and say hello. I have bookmarks and pin badges to give away as well. I'm really looking forward to it, and I'll see you there. Though awake, I fell into a dream. I thought I could see floating on the surface of the waters enormous pre-Adamite tortoises, resembling floating islands. The colossal mastodon twists and untwists his trunk and pounds with his huge tusks the fragments of rock that cover the shore, whilst the megatherium, buttressed upon his enormous hinder paws, grubs in the soil, awakening the sonorous echoes of the granite rocks with his tremendous roarings. Then my dream backed even further still, into the ages before the creation of living beings. The mammals disappear, then the birds vanish, then the reptiles, and finally the fish, the crustaceans, the mollusks. I am the only living thing in the world. All life is concentrated in my beating heart alone. Ages seem no more than days. Plants disappear. Granite rocks soften. The waters again cover the face of the earth. My body is no longer firm and terrestrial. It is resolved into its constituent atoms, and I'm lost in infinite space. Hello and welcome back to The Pirates Don't Eat the Tourists, the podcast digging through prehistoric fiction one book at a time. I'm Roland Squire, and this is really the true beginning of Season 2, Stones to Stories. That passage you just heard is Axel, our narrator, standing on a raft on an ocean that should not exist, dreaming his way backwards through the entire history of life on Earth, until there is nothing left of him at all. It was written in 1864, and I don't think anyone has captured the vertigo of deep time better in the 160 years since. This week, we are going right back to the source. Before the Lost World, before the land that time forgot, before a single dinosaur park was ever pitched to investors, Jules Verne sent a professor, his reluctant nephew, and one magnificently unbothered Icelandic guide down a volcano in search of the centre of the Earth. What they found there, a sea in the dark, monsters out of the fossil record, a herd of mastodon that may or may not have been a dream, set the template for every subterranean adventure that followed. And I could not have asked for a better travel companion on this descent. My guest today is Cian Gill, host of the Lost Valley podcast. Nobody I know thinks more carefully or more fondly about this genre, and he arrives, as ever, dressed for an expedition. So pour yourself something warming, mind the ichthyosaurs, and whatever you do, don't look down. This is Journey to the Centre of the Earth. Please welcome to the show, Cian Gill. Thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
Not too bad, Roland. Yeah, very, very good to be here. This should be a lot of fun, I think.
Yeah, no, really looking forward to it. So before we get into Verne and all the good stuff under the earth, I was wondering whether, for listeners who haven't maybe heard your podcast, just tell us a little bit about the Lost Valley show and why you started it.
Sure. So I'm the proprietor and host of the Lost Valley podcast. It's a podcast about the Lost World trope, Lost Worlds in life, lore and literature is what I often say. I've been fascinated by the Lost World trope since I was a kid. Some listeners will know me better for a much more longer running podcast called Wide Atlantic Weird, which was a wider range of, we took in a lot of cryptozoology, paranormal stuff. But I guess over the years doing that, I kind of learned to hone in on the Lost World stuff. I really, really enjoyed that. And maybe my interest in cryptozoology and the reading I've done over the last few years has kind of brought me back to something which I always did enjoy as a kid. So, I want something that has the adventure in there as well, but I also want something that has a bit of maybe weird science, maybe unexpected zoology or out of place animals or something of that sort. And also huge Michael Crichton and Jurassic Park fan as well, just like yourself.
Perfect. That's a big tick. What I also love about your podcast is the fact you present it as if you're in an explorer's lounge or stuff. And I love that.
That's it. Yeah. Yeah, bringing in some slightly old-fashioned iconography there, but we try and make the Explorers Club the sort of one in which anybody would feel welcome, I would hope.
Yes, yeah. In that tradition, I've got myself a little whiskey. It's actually an Irish whiskey as well. It's a Waterford whiskey. So I'll be sipping that throughout this conversation.
Tremendous. So, I have a small amount of Murphy Stout left over from an event at the weekend. So
perfect.
We're not too bad.
We're ready. We're ready for the adventure.
We are.
I was wondering whether you would attempt to kick us off with a bit of a synopsis for the story of Journey.
Absolutely. So Jules Verne's Journey to the Centre of the Earth. This is a tale from the mid-Victorian era. It's a classic of high adventure, I would say, and a very early and important classic of high adventure. We have three characters. Our scientist is Professor Otto Lidenbrock, depending on your translation, his nephew Axel, and their stoic Icelandic guide Hans. And together, the three of them descend into the Sneffels volcano in Iceland, following the trail of an explorer from hundreds of years earlier, a man by the name of Arne Saknussemm, because they have come to believe that this man and his writing can lead them to none other than the centre of the Earth. And while on their journey, they learn a whole lot about geology, as it was understood in the mid-19th century. They start coming across wide open spaces and caverns deep beneath the earth, including a location that comes to be known as the Lidenbrock Sea, which is a cavern so enormous that it contains a sea or an ocean within it. And once they start making their way across this ocean on a raft, they start to see evidence that there are, in fact, not only are there fossils of life from all different eras of the Earth's history, but there are, in fact, potentially living creatures, some of which they may indeed come to have encounters with as the story goes on. That's the short version of it.
No, that's fab. That's great. Thank you so much for that. When did you first? Could you remember the first time you read it?
I sure do. So right here, I have my old Ladybird Children's Classics edition.
I saw you post that on your Instagram, and it brought back some amazing memories.
This was from a whole range of books you could get. You bought them with a cassette tape, and you would play. And there's a Lost World version of this too. There's a version of Dracula. There's a version of I think Arthur Conan Doyle's Lot 249, which is just called The Mummy.
Okay, yeah,
and a few other kind of Victorian era spooky or science fiction-y classics. And this is a gorgeous book with a very strange style of illustration, slightly eccentric style of illustration here. But I remember this from being a kid. I remember stuff like how the adventure gets started, the fact that they have a code crack, the fact that they find a secret written document hidden inside an Icelandic medieval piece of writing, the fact that they have to get to the volcano at a certain time of the year in order so that the shadow will fall in the right place and show them where to go. And then I think my mind was blown by the concept of the Lidenbrock Sea, the idea of an underground cavern so big that it has its own atmosphere, it has its own atmospheric system. There's an ocean there, and there's a whole ecosystem there. And then I often say this on the show, like one of the things I look out for in Lost World media is the sort of opening Lost World scene where the characters first realize they're not in Kansas anymore. And ever since Jules Verne's Journey to the Centre of the Earth, I think having the camera pull back and show a forest of giant fungi has
yes, yeah.
So many writers have used that one over the years. It's tantamount to having the camera pull back and see that there's two moons in the sky or something like that, just to show you're somewhere strange now.
Yeah.
So yeah, really some really memorable imagery in this book.
I used to love the music that's on I don't know whether I love it or whether it's just seared into my brain, because I had to find once I saw you post that, I went onto YouTube to actually find it. When I said to my dad I was doing this this book, and he said, "Oh, do you remember that tape with all that music that just kept coming in every other page? I think it was like the signifier to turn the page was this same bit of classical music that would be play again and again and again."
Yeah, well worth a listen, folks. Yeah, there are a lot of those books. If you have memories of them, the tapes are on YouTube.
Yeah. I'll link it in the show notes because it was a good trip down memory lane.
Did you read that yourself as a kid as well?
I did, yeah. Listening to the tape mainly to go to sleep. That's just played. It was only half an hour, I think. So I must have listened to it for ages. But I remember the vivid memory of the water, and then the bit where they're listening to the water through the walls. That seemed to stick with me because I was lying in bed next to a wall, and I'd always sort of imagine what I could hear, but behind the wall. Maybe I could hear water and stuff.
And actually, some of those early chapters before things get a bit wild and wacky, where the emphasis is kind of on they're in a relatively realistic cave system, except that they've been there for days and days and days, and Axel, the young narrator, gets separated, and he's dying of thirst essentially, and it's quite a harrowing chapter. It's quite, if you've ever been lost, if you've ever been like somewhere where you're actually in danger of running out of food or water, if you've ever been on an expedition in a very large country. I did a little bit of work in the US years ago where we would send groups out into the wild for days, where you really genuinely do have to take care in a way that, it's hard to get that lost in Ireland or the UK, to the same extent. But really, just the kind of stuff that Jules Verne himself probably would have read in actual accounts of real exploration, that was very fashionable at the time.
So what edition did you read for?
So good question.
Yeah.
So when you reached out, I did not have. I wish I had the Oxford or one of the nicer recent translations. William Butcher, I believe, is the
92.
One of the recent and well regarded translations. You know what? Like in a good traditional sense, I have an old fashioned Victorian translation. So Jules Verne was ill served for literally 100 years by shoddy translations into English, almost from the beginning. And the most infamous one is by Griffith and Farren, which was 1871. And this is the edition where they change the names of characters. They, instead of being German, they're all suddenly from Edinburgh. And this made its way into the film, the 1959 movie with James Mason, where it's actually I actually quite like the Edinburgh sequences in that, but it's all because of this dodgy translation.
Right, okay, I didn't realize that's why. Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's from the 1871. Mine, I'm fairly sure now. If you buy like a cheap, reprint from one of these companies that specializes in cheap reprints, and they don't specify who the translator is, you're probably dealing with one of these Victorian ones. I'm fairly sure this one is Frederick Malleton from 1877.
Right. Okay.
So
and he's the clergyman. Is
correct? Yes.
Yeah.
He is. Some of his notes are in this, and they're very interesting. Like you're reading a Victorian critiquing another Victorian's work through a Victorian worldview. So there's some fairly dated stuff in the notes here, but
a lot of religious imagery that he always sort of connects stuff. Yeah.
And some of these translators will have removed stuff that they didn't like. Some of the British translators took out parts where Jules Verne was critical of the British Empire in some of his books. But I actually really enjoy this one. It's just the one I happen to have to hand. I have read the Oxford one on another occasion, but this happened to be the one I had in the house. And even though, yes, it's not the most up-to-date translation, it's still hugely enjoyable. And, in whatever translation you have, Verne's work is rollicking. There's something fresh and accessible about it. This is probably, I think you said, it's probably going to be the oldest work you feature on this series.
Yeah.
And it's very fresh compared to some writers from the 1870s, 80s, 90s feel stodgier than this in any translation. I feel like Jules Verne has nailed what we now consider the adventure story format remarkably early. And I went looking for earlier works in this genre to see who was working on what was the state of paleo fiction prior to this. And I have some works by, for example, Richard Fallon. His book Creatures of Another Age is a chronicle of paleo fiction from before and after this, and there's very little in the adventure story genre. So like dinosaurs were huge. There's an interesting point. There's an interesting time in the 19th century, Roland, and I'd say when Jules Verne is writing this in 1864, dinosaurs are not the superstars that they are today.
No.
I mean, they were still big. You still had the Crystal Palace dinosaurs. They were still a big deal, but also ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs were huge. Mastodons and mammoths were massive. Dinosaurs didn't necessarily have the emotional heft over those other prehistoric creatures that they do today. And I kind of think that some of that comes from, I mean, a lot of things happened in between this, but in 1912, of course, Arthur Conan Doyle writes The Lost World. That's when dinosaur fiction really comes of age. And it's worth noting that, of course, when he was at school in Stonyhurst, Arthur Conan Doyle was a huge fan of Jules Verne, and he read him in the original French.
Wow.
Yeah. So I don't know. I couldn't track down that he read Journey to the Center of the Earth for certain, but he wrote letters home to his mother, which I recorded. He talks about reading From the Earth to the Moon. He was a huge Jules Verne fan, and it is one of his biggest books, and it was easily available in Britain at the time. So I have to assume that he might have read this as a possible influence way back in the back of the psyche.
That sort of adventurous spirit. There are a lot of crossovers actually between the two. We can get to those. I've read the Frank Wynne edition from Penguin Classics. Yeah, it's a really, what I really love about it is that it actually returns a lot of that romance tradition to the language. It's quite florid. There's some wonderful sentences that are really quite beautiful, and yeah, the dreams that happen during the story, you know, they're really quite something in this edition. It was really, really nice to actually. It's the first time reading it actually for this podcast since a child. And I think reading something from the Victorian age sometimes can put people off, but actually then reading something like this, I zipped through this so quickly. You know, as you say, it's a rollicking read. There is, the second the adventure starts, it doesn't stop, because it was serialized before it was in book form. Each little chapter has a start, middle, and end, you know, and it just keeps you going from chapter to chapter.
Yes. Yeah, I was just looking at, I've got a book here called Dinosaurs in Fantastic Fiction by Alan A. Debus. You might have it there somewhere.
I've got it here.
He just notes that, he says, Verne wasn't by any means a writer of the Romantic period per se, but a butcher from the 1998 introduction, that's the Oxford edition, claimed that he was influenced by late Romanticism. It's certainly... It's late in the game, but he's still of an age that he would have remembered when scientists were also poets, you know. And it's something that Richard Fallon says, and Debus says in his book as well, which is that when you go looking for precursors to Jules Verne's work, right, his great core idea here, if we want to cut to the chase here, is the dinosaur fight, right? The idea of having his characters on an adventure, in a literal adventure story, right? We're not talking about Jonathan Swift style allegory here, you know, where characters go to a fantasy land just to like make fun of, you know, the writer's own society. We're doing something different here. We're saying, no, this is really happening. I'm providing masses of evidence and science here, in the way that Michael Crichton later would with his, you know, people call them his techno thrillers, and Jules Verne was like an early techno thriller, I suppose, with his massive info dumps that he tends to put in his books. But it's just he was ahead of the game with this, and he did something that was quite different to what had been done before. But both those authors I cited there both mention that prior to the 1860s, there was a huge interest in prehistoric animals and in dinosaurs, but most of the paleofiction was in verse. It was poetry. It was political cartoons, you know, of prominent scientists. And a lot of it was in the scientific writing itself. So people like Gideon Mantell, you know, famous for discovering the iguanodon in Sussex in the early 19th century, he would write these dry enough scientific books, but then he would say, right, I'm now going to take my imagination on a spin and take the reader through, you know, imagine what the world was like when these, you know, antediluvian creatures were roaming England. And that's what you get when you look for fictitious use of dinosaurs before Jules Verne. So there must be more solid predecessors out there, but nothing on the scale that he did, or with the influence that he had. So in the middle of the novel, I suppose the the high point for most people, and tends to be on the cover of any book or movie based on it.
And any book.
I've got the classics illustrated here from I think it's 1951. Apparently, cover artist unknown, but it's a wonderful painting of the ichthyosaurus and the plesiosaurus. And we might do a little reading later if you
Yes, definitely.
if you'll indulge me. We might read a little bit from that scene because it's so fun the way it's written. And this was, this is what has kept the book in print for so many years. This is what led, other paleo artists, other paleo writers to say, well, okay, we need our animals in Mortal Kombat. Charles R. Knight draws the famous painting in 1906 of the Tyrannosaurus and the Triceratops. Of course, forever after, that's the classic lineup. But before that, you had Jules Verne and the ichthyosaurus fighting the plesiosaurus. Wonderful stuff.
And supposedly that there was talk that Crystal Palace, the plesiosaur and the ichthyosaur, were going to be in that sort of locked in that battle, actually in the park. There is word of that was going to be part of it.
So it's worth mentioning quickly, actually, that there's 2 editions of the book. So the basic book came out in 1864. In 1867, there's a kind of a revised extended edition, and I'll make a sneak in a Jurassic Park joke and a Father Ted joke here and say that it's like a special edition with extra dinosaurs, because he essentially adds in 3 extra chapters that come with more prehistoric material, which weren't in the original version. So it's not certain like what happened in the intervening years, except that there was the interest in paleontology was just building. There were more specimens found. There was a Paris exhibition, I believe, in those years that Fern may have gone to. I presume there must have been fossils on show there as well, being as it was big business at the time. But that's when he adds in some of the stuff in the later chapters when they land on the far side of the Lidenbrock Sea, and they come across an endless boneyard filled with the remains of creatures from all different eras in the Earth's prehistory. And they come across then kind of it's described variously as a fossil or as a mummified, anatomically modern human. Now, Jules Verne is being very canny here. He's kind of sidestepping anything about evolution because France, of course, still a very Catholic and a very traditional country, and whatever he may have believed himself, he tended to listen to his publisher, Pierre Jules Hetzel, who had his eye on the market and would take out stuff that he thought maybe wouldn't be so popular with your average middle class French person or French family. He liked to keep things family friendly, keep things ambiguous with regards to religion. So Jules Verne doesn't mention anything about evolution. He drops in a few weird phrases like, evidently creation had advanced much since the previous day.
There's strange turns of phrases throughout it, which you kind of, that you're exactly right with the sidestepping the difficult issues. But I think if you were in the know reading this, then I think you would have understood kind of where he was coming from.
Yeah, and I think contemporaries probably felt the same way, but he doesn't show his hand, I suppose, directly in those cases. And again, one theme he does hit on again and again is how there is this gradual directionalism in the history of life on Earth. He doesn't use any words like evolution, but the history of life on Earth, it's like an update on the old Scala Natura idea that, there's a natural place for everything. God has placed everything in ranking order of becoming more complex and more important, obviously leading up to us. And he does have Lidenbrock say a couple of times that, man is on top of this whole system. We are the most important. And actually an interesting thing did you notice how Lidenbrock is very brave and almost foolhardy? He's like a 1950s science fiction scientist. He's like, science is the light. Science will show us the way. Science, and Jules Verne is actually remembered that way himself because, his stories portray science in a very positive light. But again, that was his editor. He was more cynical in real life, and he had stories nixed by Jules Hetzel that didn't fit into this positive scientific idea. He had a story called Paris in the 20th Century, which was very cynical about a future Paris where technology has advanced and everybody has access to all these wonderful gadgets, but that culturally they have become stagnant, decadent. And his editor said, no, that's not the way your audience sees you. You're the high priest of science is positive. Isn't it? So isn't it odd how Lidenbrock is like that, but then Axel, the young fellow, he's a complete scaredy cat.
Yes, I love
He spends the whole novel trying to back out of the expedition.
I love the juxtaposition between Lidenbrock and, I think it's important that it is quite a funny book. Like and the exchanges between, it starts off with the housekeeper and him, like Lidenbrock bursting in, trying to decipher the code, won't let anybody leave, won't let anybody have any food until he's sorted this out. And there's just very funny exchanges that are going on that, there's a light-heartedness to the story that, I mean, it has to please everybody. So there is everything in this story. There is science, there is adventure, there's romance in its more modern term as well.
Of course, The Lost World is very funny as well when you go back.
Yes, it is.
Conan Doyle was an absolute master of that. And speaking of the cipher, the code, Jules Verne was a huge fan of Edgar Allan Poe. And Edgar Allan Poe is famous for several things, including inventing, an early version of the detective story and using codes and ciphers in his work, particularly in The Gold Bug. And so I always enjoy the code that they have to crack at the beginning of this one. But commentators often make the connection between Jules Verne and Edgar Allan Poe with regards to the idea of the hollow earth.
Yes.
Which is a topic we're going to have to get around to.
Yeah.
Actually, it has been an obscure idea for most of my life. I've always been fascinated by it, but I rarely saw much written about it. But it is highly prominent in the MonsterVerse movies at the moment, which blows my mind. Like, they're these huge, big, noisy blockbusters. The latest one was described as a headache of a movie.
I thoroughly enjoyed it. I don't know what people say. Yeah, so the idea of the hollow earth is that is really, no pun intended, maybe it is intended, at the core of this is the hollow earth theory. Do you mind explaining a little bit about what you take that to mean? Yeah,
so the most important person in the history of this idea is there's a fellow named John Cleave Sims in the early 19th century. He's Captain John Cleave Sims. He's kind of a washed up ex-army fellow in St. Louis, Missouri, and he's a trader. He's trading with the native peoples. He's swapping goods for people who are heading out west, and this is in like 1818 thereabouts. And he comes up with this idea, and nobody really knows where he got it from. Probably he read something that talks about Edmund Halley, the astronomer.
Okay.
And he had a much earlier version of this idea that he was trying to explain phenomena that weren't well understood at the time, like the aurora borealis. And his idea was like, well, there must be some interior light inside the Earth, and it comes out somehow.
Okay.
And that this is somehow creating the aurora borealis. So John Cleave Sims would have had access to a popular book of science written by, of all people, Cotton Mather, the guy from the witch trials in Salem.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So he also wrote popular science books as well as being a witch hunter. Strange guy. But this is one of the few books that he would have had access to that would have given him some idea of this hollow earth thing. But other than that, it's not really known where he got it from. So his idea was that the earth was hollow, and there were several globes inside the one. And in 1818, he puts out his famous, he calls it his circular number 1. I'm going to get you a read up of this because it's worth hearing. And it says, "To all the world, I declare the earth is hollow and habitable within, containing a number of solid concentric spheres, one within the other, and that it is open at the poles 12 or 16 degrees. I pledge my life in support of this truth, and am ready to explore the hollow if the world will support and aid me in this undertaking. I ask for 100 brave companions, well equipped to start from Siberia in the fall season, with reindeer and sleighs on the ice of the frozen sea. I engage that we will find a warm and rich land, stocked with thrifty vegetables and animals, if not men, on reaching 1 degree northward of latitude 82, and we will return in the following spring." So he had this idea, the earth is hollow, and what he kind of added to the story that nobody had before was that there were these holes in the poles. And this is a weird little idea that pops up again and again in science fiction, in kind of cranks and crackpots. It's in modern day UFO conspiracism all through the 20th century as well. It pops up again and again, and he's not terribly successful himself. He tries a lecture tour trying to spread this idea. He doesn't get too far. Eventually, one of his followers is more successful in getting the US to fund some expeditions, but it's more that they're looking for the Northwest Passage. They're looking for a way.
Okay.
They're hoping that there's like an open path through the ice, or maybe even an open polar sea, which is another idea which shows up in Hollow Earth fiction all the time. But basically, this idea, Edgar Allan Poe was interested in this idea. Also, an American living kind of around the same time. So in the 1840s, he writes a whole lot of stories which have little hints that there's a Hollow Earth idea in there. He has one story where a chap goes up in a balloon and actually gets to the moon, but on his way up he sees that the Earth is slightly flattened at the top and that there's some mysterious dark hole that he can see from space. So he never goes all the way and explains what's going on there, and he has a famous kind of unfinished novel called Arthur Gordon Pym, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, and it's kind of famous because it has a weird ending that just comes to a sudden end where he's hinting that there's something extremely weird at the North Pole, but he's not going to let the readers find out what it is. So it's often been presumed that he might have been taking that novel in a Hollow Earth direction. But he's translated into French by the French poet Charles Baudelaire, and he was very, very popular in France. So Jules Verne was a huge, huge fan. Now, based on that description of Hollow Earth, do you think Jules Verne had that in mind? Do you think that the Journey to the Centre of the Earth is a true Hollow Earth novel?
He feels like he really goes, I don't know. I think he's using it in a different way. And I think because of reading Alan Debus's book and the idea of the caves and how caves feature in a lot of prehistoric literature, I feel like that's the angle that he's originating from, and that maybe then that's his way into the story, whether it's just a big cave rather than a hollow earth. Does that make sense, that there can be two different things?
Yeah, I think I agree with you. And having said all that about the hollow earth, I don't want to overstate the influence of it on Verne here. I think he was aware of it. John Cleave Sims was well known early in the 19th century, even if he was considered a crank by most. I think Verne didn't read any English, I know that. So anything he would have come across this would have been kind of second, third hand. And Poe's references to it are quite slight, even though I know Verne was a huge fan. When you read Journey, what did they get? About 86 miles down, something like that. So they're only what he's proposing is a series of hollow caverns beneath Europe, basically. So yeah, I don't know. I think, look, it's part of the story. It's part of the history of the Hollow Earth idea, but it's not. I don't know how influenced he really was by Sims.
That's fascinating. I hadn't really thought about it until you said that, and then piecing that together with the caves in prehistory and the fact that, so as you were saying earlier, a lot of the early prehistoric fiction, it actually comes from non-fiction. They had to have a way of describing how things fitted together before we arrived, or kind of like holding the hand of the public to lead them into a different world. And that's exactly what Verne does with this. The idea that caves were where fossils were found, so like cave bears and all of that sort of stuff. So therefore the idea is that that's the environment that they lived in. So therefore we get these stories.
Geology is the main theme of the book, geology and paleontology to some degree. So it makes sense that that's where they would be. And Verne always had a didactic element to his work. He's trying to teach you something.
Yep.
So, his books before this were, I think, 5 Weeks in a Balloon, which is about Africa and has all this geographical data. And then he writes the Adventures of Captain Hatteras, which is about going to the poles. His background in writing, outside of being in the theatre and stuff, was writing for family magazines that were effectively science articles or general information articles. So his job was synthesizing data and making it palatable and understandable to the general public. So you could say he probably started off with this one as an idea of like, where do I set my story, my next adventure, where I want to talk about geology?
Yes, yeah.
Probably came from that.
It's, he has to have the science involved because that's what the publisher wants him to have, because the idea that children are there's some education kind of sort of educational element involved in this story. I think the adventure is what he really loves.
Yeah, you can kind of see the the difference. Like his enthusiasm for the science
It does.
kind of wanes a little bit, and as the book goes on, and he's more interested in conjuring up fantastic stuff. And he gets extremely loosey goosey with the science that he's promoting, because his main idea, like in order for his characters to get into the interior of the Earth, he has to do away with the concept of the Earth having a red hot molten core.
Yeah.
So because that would burn his characters to a crisp. And yet that what we might know this. Our reader today might know this reading now, but that's the by the time Verne is writing, scientists presumed that the Earth was molten and hot. But he has to trot out an already out-of-date theory in order to have his characters be able to get inside the Earth.
So sort of the adventure of Verne and his early life. I read that at the age of 11, he ran off to sea, essentially, became a ship's boy. He didn't get very far. The ship was planned to get to India, and I think he just got a few miles down the coast before his dad came and picked him up. There was a line that was in Adam Roberts' book. So Verne, when his father eventually caught up with him, he said, "I will no longer travel except in my dreams," which is the perfect quote for any poet or author out there, that he was ready at the age of 11.
That's it. And that's a story he told often in his adult life. And you will often see people will kind of take the next step and say, oh, he never left his home ever again, or he never left France ever again, and he only traveled in his imagination, which is a really tidy kind of a myth that was told about Verne for a long time. He was reasonably well traveled. Actually, he traveled around Europe, and he spent a very short amount of time in America as well. And he did own a boat, and he would do a lot of his own travels. So I think it's fair to say a lot of the more exotic places that he writes about in his novels, he didn't go to those places, and he was taking information from textbooks and such.
So the whole process of the book is that they travel into the Earth, and my connection to anything while reading it was things like Dante. Lidenbrock is the Virgil in this, and Axel is Dante as his guide, taking him through the caves and into the underworld. And essentially, in Verne, they never ascend the heights of heaven. Essentially, they don't move very much forward from where they started as characters or as anything. They just go through this adventure. And particularly the start of it, even before they get into the Earth, Verne loves dissecting every element of like how much you pack, what's the practicalities of getting a boat from A to B, all of these things, the landscapes of the places that he's going to. It's a real travel log, and then that's very cleverly mirrored that when they get into the Earth, that then that travel log is through time rather than just place.
I think it's one of the things that makes the novel feel fresh is that verisimilitude. Like Axel keeps the log while they're traveling on the Lidenbrock Sea. So when they're in the most ridiculous part of the story, he's using a technique which you've already seen used while he's traveling to Iceland. While he's so you kind of buy it for that reason. It's very effective.
And that blending of, that's where the Crichton kind of connection, I think, comes in. Like to take it to Jurassic Park, is starting with those big wide shots and then slowly zooming in to the story. And because you've been bombarded with all of this scientific data and sort of ideas, that you just it sort of beats you into submission and going, I believe this story. And then before you know it, the adventure's kicked off, and then you forget to ever sort of question the world that you're in.
Even to the end, when the most ridiculous part of the story, of course, is how they get back up again at the end, which is that they're on this flimsy raft which ends up in the channel of a volcano. Which
I know it doesn't make.
If you stop and think about it for like a moment, it's really, and yet you're swept along with it because the book is so good, the writing is so good.
It feels like I need to find the ending to this story, and so that's what he does.
Yeah.
So at the middle of the story, and the bit that really stays with us, the bit that gets on the front cover of all the books, is the ichthyosaur-plesiosaur battle. What do you think of this moment in for this story? Why do you think that out of all the other encounters in it is the bit that is it because essentially it is just a big fight? Is that what is that why it feels like the main part of the story?
Yeah, there's a time when I talk about this material when I break down from all the analysis and I just say, look, dinosaurs are cool, right? And this happens to me when I'm talking about Jurassic Park as well. I've done episodes where I get into the weeds about Crichton's attitudes towards science and linking to Mary Shelley and Frankenstein and everything. But there's just something like it's just an amazing subject matter, and he lucked out when he came up with that. And there's a reason why he's done a lot of interesting stuff, but there's a reason why it's the one that hits home still, and in 100 years, that's the one thing he did that would be remembered. And I think it's the same for Jules Verne and choosing these creatures, these monsters. Okay, they're not dinosaurs. I'll put that out there for anyone who's screaming at their phone. But he just chose really, really well. Like ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs are astonishing animals. Like the whole history of the Loch Ness monster comes from the turn of the century fascination with plesiosaurs. It absolutely does. You've got them showing up in books and movies ever since. And I suppose the characters themselves are so tiny in that scene. They're constantly at risk of being swept away by the mere movements of these animals, what they do to the ocean. It's like Godzilla, it's like the humans are shrunk in their importance. And it's a reminder of, what these prehistoric animals meant to the Victorians, which was the discovery of this world where humans are or were not important. We're here now, but it's like they realize we're only here on sufferance, Things, if we messed up and or do something wrong to the earth, things could change. In their day, they worried about maybe displeasing God. In our day, we worry about climate, we worry about environmentalism. Although there's a tiny little note in Journey to the Center of the Earth where Jules Verne has this weird conservationist moment where he talks about the coal deposits and he says they'll all be gone in less than 300 years if the industrialized nations of Europe don't learn to ration their activities, which is extremely, but it's all about man's place in the world, and this discovery of a world where we were not the most important thing. We're physically small, we're helpless, and here we are being battered around on this raft as these creatures. They don't even know we're there. It's almost Lovecraftian, right?
Yeah. We are so low down in the pecking order that we're not factoring into we can see their world, but we're not part of it. We're not part of their world at all.
And isn't that like when people try and understand why are kids inherently fascinated by dinosaurs? Is it because they represent this power greater than the teacher, greater than the parent? Is it something that dwarfs us and doesn't care about us? And there's something exciting about that. So, but it's also right place, right time. Nobody had done this before. It's a perfect climax to a story. Everything is building to this. He's carefully laid the foundations to this. There's a great what would you call it, foreshadowing a couple of chapters before this when they're on the boat. They're realizing just how big this sea is, and I think it's Hans drops a tool down into the ocean just to gauge the depth of it, and he pulls it up and it's got teeth marks in it, and that there's something big and dangerous in there. Oh, tremendous! It is
fantastic.
It's like the water, shivering in Jurassic Park when the T-Rex is nearby.
Yeah. Did you want to read us a little piece from it?
Let's do a little bit. And in fact, 2 liquid columns were rising to a considerable height above the sea. We stood amazed, thunderstruck at the presence of such a herd of marine monsters. They were of supernatural dimensions. The smallest of them would have crunched our raft, crew and all, at one snap of its huge jaws. Hans wants to tack to get away from this dangerous neighbourhood, but he sees on the other hand enemies not less terrible. A tortoise 40 feet long, and a serpent of 30, lifting its fearful head and gleaming eyes above the flood. Flight was out of the question now. The reptiles rose. They wheeled around our little craft with a rapidity greater than that of express trains. They described around us gradually narrowing circles. I took up my rifle, but what could a ball do against the scaly armour with which these enormous beasts were clad? Great stuff.
Fantastic. I love the amount. So when I was at the Crystal Palace and talking to Andrew there, and the fact that the only way to describe these creatures was to use present day animals and things. So they were all amalgamations of things. They were either frogs, and the plesiosaur is a turtle with a shell, and it's all these different creatures combined into one monster. It's a monster, and that's where that word really comes into play with in this battle.
Yeah, so I also really enjoy that. There's loads of tremendous passages in this, but even the stuff with the vegetation they come across.
Mm-hmm.
And again, another thing I look out for on the podcast very often when I'm looking at Lost World stories is, like, how do you convey the sense that the landscape they're in is eerie and weird?
Mm.
And I enjoy, like, iconography of, let's say, the Carboniferous period has always given me that vibe, you know?
Yeah.
You know, when you're a kid and you have a book on dinosaurs, there's always a chapter on the Carboniferous first. And you've got the giant moss trees and everything, and you've got the Meganeura, the giant insects, the flying insects, and it's just so alien.
Yeah.
And Jules Verne, later on in the novel, they come across the forest of mushrooms, and they come across an area of vegetation from every part of the world, all living in harmony in one place, but without any sunlight, and therefore without any color. You know, presumably no chlorophyll. They're getting their nutrients from somewhere else. And so they're all described as this kind of monochrome brown, which is deliciously eerie.
Yeah.
And one I've never seen a film or an artist tackle that one quite in a way that
I suppose the interesting thing about those, just you saying that, is so the original, the 1959 version of Journey to the Centre of the Earth, I suppose, is there for its technicolor. It's at that crossover time where really you couldn't have that sort of element in there because you wanted to show off the colour and the vibrancy of it. And then actually, when Brendan Fraser's film comes out, that's a 3D. So that's a new technology that it's throwing into it.
Neither would be too inclined to give you some monochrome.
I want this all to be black and white, this bit. And you're like, no,
I'm reminded of something else about the film, which is that I had a memory as a kid of watching the Filmation cartoon version of Journey to the Centre of the Earth.
You're right, I don't think I've seen
in the 1970s. So Filmation did the cartoon versions of the Star Trek cartoon.
Right, okay, yeah.
So they look like Hanna-Barbera cartoons, but they're well, some of them are more interesting. They also did a short-lived Planet of the Apes series.
Oh, I know that one, yeah.
So they did a cartoon version of Journey to the Centre of the Earth. Every episode, the characters are trying to, find the center of the Earth, and they come across some like lost civilization or some lost world or something. And there are 3 or 4 characters traveling, and they have a duck or a goose, a duck with them.
Yeah, there's a duck, yeah.
And I could not believe that was taken from the film. I thought, that's such a silly Saturday morning cartoon.
Yeah.
Oh, they've got a duck with them, it's like Scooby-Doo. And it's actually from the film. I couldn't believe it.
No, and I watched recently another Jules Verne adaptation, although it's very, very loosely Jules Verne. It's got Vincent Price in it. And they're all
Master of the World?
It's when they're all under, it's like a city of the gods.
Oh.
Demons of the something.
It's not Jules Verne or Captain Nemo and the underwater city?
No, it's more Edgar Allan Poe than it is Verne. And it's got the person from Mary Poppins, the dad from Mary Poppins, David Tomlinson, and he's got a chicken with him the entire time. So it's clearly it's filmed just after Journey to the Centre of the Earth, so we need a foil animal in that. Although the chicken does survive the entire journey, I still can't get over the fact that the spoilers, I'm terribly sorry, but
I was shocked.
The duck does not survive going into the centre of the Earth.
He comes to an awful end.
Awful end, yeah.
Oh, man.
I think that's the interesting part of the adaptations, actually, of a lot of Verne stuff. Have you read any other Verne? Have you read like Around the World in 80 Days?
I've read From the Earth to the Moon, and I've read 20,000 Leagues.
Mm-hmm.
I must have read something. I've made a start on Mysterious Island, but that's at least.
Yeah,
yeah. But I'm a big fan of the 1961 film.
Yes, and what they do in adaptations, like watching, this is Kim Newman saying about this, but firstly, the boom for Verne adaptations at that time was the fact that he'd come out of copyright, and so he was certainly free. So it's the slightly cheaper films to make out of.
Yeah,
but he thinks, and I agree, that actually the film versions are sometimes slightly more not better, but like as a story-wise, there are elements to it. So Journey, they have a strong female character that follows them into the earth. There is a villain. There is almost like a ticking clock element to these stories. The only one that really has that is Around the World in 80 Days, because he needs to do it in 80 days. The other stories are more big, sprawling adventures, really, that like the ending of Journey to the Center of the Earth. He just has to find a way to end the story. So let's shoot back up in big stream of water, because otherwise I think he'd just keep writing and writing and writing, you know.
I mean, some of that is due to him being a pioneer. You know, he's writing at such an early stage of the formation of what we now recognize as the adventure novel. Those tropes that we expect weren't set, many of them, you know, and like, what did he have to, like, you go back and read Edgar Allan Poe, which was a big influence on him, and there's elements there that are recognizably adventure stories, you know, like in Arthur Gordon Pym is about a disastrous sea voyage, but at the same time, it's shapeless and messy compared to what we now expect from a screenplay or from a story. And, you know, a huge influence on everybody would have been the likes of Robinson Crusoe or the Swiss Family Robinson, you know, which are like, they're very moral, they're very instructing, they're there to teach you a lesson how to be a good Christian. Like, yes, they have adventures in them, but they have different goals. And I think Jules Verne is a huge step forward on the road to the modern adventure story. And when and where his stories work, it's where I think he's accidentally or by design he's hitting on. You know, it's comparable, I would say, to the evolution of the modern blockbuster in the 1970s with Spielberg and George Lucas. You know, they were slowly crawling towards this form that we now recognize as
essentially
as being all powerful. And then when you go back to stuff earlier than that, like go back and watch, you know, film from the 60s and earlier, and it's just all the expectations are different, the timings are different, the beats are different. They knew what they were doing, but we've been so surrounded by a particular form of media for so long now that going back and looking at the original and where it came from is it can be alienating sometimes.
Yeah, but I do enjoy, because there are no rules set. So a couple of my favourite moments are the mastodon scene with the 12-foot giant that they suddenly stumble across, and there is no resolution to that at all. It is just presented to you that they see a herd of mastodon, and then underneath, the way it's really unsettling how he describes it, that they see this giant essentially underneath a tree, and his hair is messy, they can't see his face, and they don't investigate anymore. They don't even speculate. Really, they just turn tail and go.
And that might be a little bit of the capital R romantic in there rather than the realism of an adventure tale, you know. Axel is not even sure that he really saw this after they leave. He's wondering if it's a dream, and it's presented in a way that is kind of dreamlike. And Jules Verne has made extensive use earlier when they're on the raft of the dream sequence. Axel has a hallucination of all of the history of life passing before his eyes, and it's wonderful. So, on the other hand, those are some of the later chapters that he stuffed in after 1867, and he was just looking to put in more prehistoric material because it was popular. The underwater fight had been popular with the public. He's kind of treading on thin ice when he deals with the history of humans because of this tightrope he's trying to walk. With, you know, and he mentions actual fossil finds from France at the time that were current. But he doesn't want to go into what the implications were. Now, Charles Darwin's Origin of Species had come out only a few years before. It was 1859. I couldn't tell you. I think it was translated in French maybe 3 or 4 years after that. So around about the time that, I mean, French scientists were aware of what was in it. But, you know, really not long before he's writing his book. So it's very fresh. It's still very controversial. And he's extremely careful about what he does and doesn't say. And yet, isn't that the obvious? You're right to say that it goes nowhere. There's no resolution. And yet the whole time he's building up from, you know, first they find prehistoric vegetation, then they find fish, then they find ancient reptiles, then they find, you know, ice age mammals, and now they find man. There's a scale to it that would have made sense to a Victorian. In terms
I wonder whether the fact that he adds the giant that makes him a giant is a way to take away from the fact that it's it's somebody that we could recognize as ourselves, maybe distancing it a little bit more and bringing it back to the classical realm of giants and stuff in Greek.
Or even the biblical,
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Perhaps it does feel thematically satisfying to me because of that chronology of life that he's going for. But yes, like he almost has to leave it a little bit mystical, a little bit vague. Maybe it was a dream. Maybe I'm not being literal here.
Yeah.
And maybe he wasn't really human either. Maybe he was something else, But it's brief, but it is spooky.
It is. I remembered it always used to, the illustration in that Ladybird book always used to freak me out. And I never used to really like looking at that picture. And yeah, sometimes I'm always that. I love anything that sort of dangles a carrot but doesn't give you the full, it leaves the mystery there as well.
And in general, he doesn't really explain why there are prehistoric animals inside the Earth.
No.
Anyway, there's a theory mentioned, which is that the Earth has cooled or gone through a cooling period in deep time, and that therefore this cooling caused the Earth's surface to buckle and crack at certain points, and that animals or plants may have fallen down into these caverns at that time. But he's a bit ambiguous about it, and he's especially ambiguous about the boneyard that they find. Are all these creatures, are they just fossils the same way fossils are on the surface, or are these animals all which live here now in this cavern? And Axel actually wonders out loud after they find the fossil of a human. He says, "Are these cavemen are they here? Could I meet one walking down the beach if I was to go?" And that's very haunting. So even if Jules Verne had never gone full caveman later, that little hook there, if he'd left that hang, that would have been spooky enough.
Yeah. Well, I think, and again, when they pull up the weight with the bite marks in it, he's all about that foreshadowing. And almost tune in next week to hear how the story goes. He's really savvy in that way of how you keep a reader reading the story.
Yeah, I was just going through my notes there. I have I don't know, as you come across as you go through your season and you explore later books, and you're going to be thinking about the influence of Verne being, as it is, as you say, the earliest stop on the journey. It's interesting to think about the ways in which what he did here in this book was and wasn't used. What was used, what was discarded going forward. Certainly the use of dinosaurs or prehistoric creatures for sensation was a huge hit. Maybe the geology and the didactic, the educational sections maybe less so. Although again, Crichton, the joy of reading Crichton, even as a kid, was always those tech bits. You felt like you were learning something about how the world worked, and it was like being let in on a secret about whether he was talking about some type of science or some type of industry, or he could be talking about all sorts of things, and you believe him he did enough research to make you believe that he knows what he's talking about, and in that way, a very direct descendant of Jules Verne.
Yeah, and I was in Alan Davis's book, he says again about the mystery of the element of this story. The fact of the code that's got to be cracked at the start is similar to the DNA that has to be extracted from the amber, and therefore that lets this story happen. It can't, the two things that you need to have that element of that mystery.
Actually, there are a few elements in this book precisely which make it feel particularly modern, because they did go on to become solid tropes of Lost World fiction and adventure fiction. And one of them is the secret document, right? That tells you, that kicks off the adventure, the call to adventure. I generally prefer it when characters are deliberately looking for a thing rather than
just suddenly come across
when they fall on it by accident. Jurassic Park 1 is better than Jurassic Park 3 because they're paleontologists. They care about dinosaurs. They are having an emotional reaction to seeing their life's work in front of them in real life. Whereas 3, and I have a lot of good things to say about it, is about some people who don't really want to be there.
Yeah.
And it kind of happens by accident. And that is an important emotional difference. So the fact that Lidenbrock is a scientist and he's a geologist, I think a lot of great adventure stories have the main character be a specialist in the area that they're going to they're going to, we meet Alan Grant on the dig, because it's setting us up for him having a satisfying emotional experience later on. And it's the same with Lidenbrock. He deeply cares about what he's doing. We learn about what his house is like, how it's full of types rock samples and fossils. And even Axel, who doesn't want to be there. And I do think that's a bit of a misstep. It is funny, but when you have a character who doesn't want to be there, like over 3/4 of the way through, the writer has to keep coming up with artificial ways to
I know.
keep him in
He's
the
always
story.
like bumping his head or something. It's the most accident-prone person I can think of.
You've got the map, something that tells you how to get there, which has been set by and this is very interesting to me because all these famous stories of exploration, right? The Journey to the Center of the Earth, The Lost World, and King Solomon's Mines, probably three of the most important examples of the genre. All of them have characters who are following an example set by somebody else. They're not actually the first people to go there and do it.
Yes.
You've got the Maple White diary.
Yeah.
Right? That leads Professor Challenger to the Lost World.
Isn't it? It's that element of like if we're calling some of them science fiction stories, it's that element of building out the world at which, and again that adds to the believability of this place, is that this is lived in, this has an existence.
Yeah, wouldn't you imagine that a writer would say, "Oh, it'll be better if these characters are the first people to ever go to the place, right? Just to find the mysterious Lost World," and yet in practice, it's kind of more interesting when they have to solve some kind of a puzzle or follow clues, and that necessitates someone else having done it before. Like, we never find out how Arne Saknussemm figured all this out. How did he know to go to this particular Sneffels cone at a particular date? And,
and he's sort of lost through, because they find runes of him or marks of him through the earth, but really that's sort of ditched towards the end.
Did he get there? Did he go any further down than they did? We don't know. He's lost.
You don't find him. You don't. That's another connection that the film then tries to make, is the villain of the piece.
The bad guy Count. He's in the cartoon as well, actually.
Right. Okay.
Although he looks quite different, and he's got a kind of a goofy sidekick as well.
Yeah.
Although he kind of does in the film too. But it's just amazing to me how those elements have been a part of adventure fiction all throughout the 20th century.
Yeah.
The map or the codex that starts off the adventure, and then having to follow the clues, having some historical adventurer who's done it first. The one character who believed, the crazy scientist who believes in this daft thing, and no one else takes him seriously. Yeah. That's underplayed a bit in this book, but you have to assume that if there had been a scene where Lidenbrock had to go down to the local university and plead his case, that he'd have been laughed off the stage, as Professor Challenger would be.
Yeah. There's more of it, I think, in Lost World, isn't there? Because I think
although
Doyle
it's hinted that
as well.
He's seen as a bit of a joke by his students.
Yeah, and he's obviously clearly an eccentric. The way that he is, and I think another bit is that cave bit, the going through the cave, and that is the start, or that's the passage that you need some physical thing to go through to actually enter into this Lost World or whatever.
Just like Professor Challenger has to cross over the gap between the crag and the plateau. Yeah, there has to be a physical barrier or a physical crossing. And I think the most I will go to bat for defending the Peter Jackson King Kong as one of my favorite Lost World stories, which not everybody will. But there's a really overdone sequence where Anne Darrow is crossing onto the ship, the Venture, and he undercranks the camera as her foot steps onto the gangplank, and he's beating over the head of she is now leaving the regular world and entering the special world. If you want to get into what's his name, hero of 1,000 faces type stuff, and he overdoes it in that film. But I know what he's going for, and that is an important moment if you get it right.
Yeah, there's an element, and I mentioned it on my Jurassic Park film episode, which is that when Alan Grant opens up the caravan, the door opens the wrong way as when you switch the shot. Now, that could just be a mistake. However, now this is somebody that I know that told me about this. He was a huge fan of Spielberg, friend of Kubrick's, student of Kubrick as well. The scene in The Shining of when Jack goes into the walk-in freezer, the door closes one way, but when he's let out by the ghosts, it opens another way.
You'd nearly believe that sort of thing with Kubrick. That he meant it. I have to ask, so are you a believer in this is an aside, are you a believer in the Alan Grant fastening the seatbelt in the helicopter.
Yeah, I know that one.
So
The fact that
it works on two levels, right?
Yeah.
The one which is more plausible is that it shows that he's a problem solver.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
The other
my
one,
read of it. Yeah.
the other one people often will say is that it's a hint as to the dinosaurs reproducing while being all female.
Yeah. But I like the idea.
I like
the idea that the barrier for Grant, because the second he steps into that caravan, he then meets Hammond. That's what starts his journey.
That's
is
really
that weird flip of him? That's and I see it every time now and I think this is the starting point of the film. And there's a couple of other, when I was watching Rebirth or thinking about Rebirth, I don't know, have you seen the latest Jurassic?
Yeah. Let's see it. Yeah.
And the idea of the cave, and I thought, how does the family enter the island? Well, they get thrown in the water, and then they go through a cave system, actually into and it's that element that you need something that is the physical to actually give you, the audience, the jolt into the new world, that they will then accept everything from this point forward as being as true as the bit that came before.
And if you want to go even further and I first saw this written about, of all things, the Planet of the Apes that was made by Tim Burton. Not a great film, but when Marky Mark comes out of his Mark Wahlberg comes out of his space pod and it sinks down into it. You could say this about the original Planet of the Apes too, but it's more obvious in that one. It's a literal rebirthing scenario where he comes out of this pod, he comes out of the water, and he's in this new world. But I really like when there's a clear, definite separation of the mundane world and then the special world.
Yeah.
And it can be done in lots of different ways. It can be subtle, or it can be sledgehammer. But I always enjoy that. And again, something that you get a certain amount of in Journey. They have to, I suppose, the figuring out which passage to go down the volcano is a type of a cipher as well. It's a type of a code that they have to crack as part of following the breadcrumbs that were left by Sack Newsom.
And the practicalities of building the raft and all of these sort of things that goes on through it. And you have the stoic presence of Hans all the way through as their helper, who never complains and is just waiting for his payment at the end of all of this. It's just there to serve. And
Verne cheats a tiny little bit with his technology sometimes. So he's known as this, like in terms of science fiction, as you know, as science fiction goes, his reputation is that he predicted things that happened shortly afterwards, right? He wrote about men going to the moon. He writes about a submarine, which is more advanced than actual submarines were at the time. But so he's relatively soft science fiction in general, at least in how he's remembered. But he cheats a tiny little bit. He gives these characters a type of a torch and a battery that is able to do things that batteries were not able to do at the time, which he kind of needs to, or else they won't be able to traverse these caverns. In 20,000 Leagues, the Nautilus is powered by electricity, but Captain Nemo says something like, "Oh, my electricity is not everyone's." So he's like, he's got some power source that I'm not going to talk about.
Yeah.
So he's not afraid to do a little bit of hand waving.
Yeah. Fab. I was wondering if there was one moment or one landscape that, if you could take a listener of this and just drop them into, what would be that scene? What would be that moment of this story?
So there's a section when Axel has been goofing off as usual and gets himself lost, and he requires, I think, a whole day of sleeping to recover. And he wakes up and he hears the sound of the ocean.
Yeah.
Which I think you mentioned earlier. And he just doesn't really realize what's going on. He's still saying, like, lads, we can still turn around and go home. We all know this isn't going anywhere. Yeah. And they kind of forcibly take him to the edge of the cavern where he sees the Lidenbrock Sea for the first time. And it's the first time the book really gets like heavy science fiction. You know, up until now they've been spelunking effectively. And this is where something really out there happens. And I really enjoyed this scene in the movie, in the 50s movie. I think it's a lovely matte painting.
Yeah.
And again, I've always been haunted by that scene in the Ladybird book as well. You know, as a much simpler version of it. But would love to be able to see that. It's one of the classic moments of "You're not in Kansas anymore."
Yeah, that's fab. Well, I'd just like to say thank you so much for taking this journey into the centre of the earth with me. It's been really fun. So with the Lost Valley podcast, is there what do you recommend people starting with in your back catalogue? Is there a particular way in, do you think?
I think if you're listening to this and you're a Crichton fan, we have 2 episodes about the book and the movie Congo. Now, you may not be a huge fan of either of those, not a huge amount of people are, but I love them both so much, and I go into so much detail on them. And for me, they're both a really, really interesting take the Lost World story in recent years. It's a comparatively late version of the genre. It's written and filmed at a time when I suppose the genre is considered a tiny bit washed up, perhaps. And I think you'll be surprised and interested to see what someone as creative as Crichton was able to do with this when he kind of deliberately set about resuscitating an old-fashioned genre with the book. And you'd be surprised also how much interesting stuff that's in the book actually made its way into the admittedly a little bit daft movie. So yeah, I would recommend checking out those episodes. I'm very proud of them.
I love those episodes. And actually, Eddie Guimont, who've had on the podcast various times, he will be joining me in a few episodes' time to look at the cryptozoology element, so the real life story behind some of the Lost World adventures, which will be really fun.
Oh, I look forward to that.
Yeah. And I was wondering if there was an episode that you have coming up on the show that you're really excited about working on.
Yeah, so I'm gearing myself up for going through the Arthur Conan Doyle's Lost World, perhaps chapter by chapter, maybe perhaps 2 chapters per episode, something like that. There's a lot of great writing and a lot of great commentary on that book out already. So I'm hoping to make it, I don't want to be doubling up or doing anything redundant. I hope to make it really, really personal. I hope to be able to explain why it's so important to me, why it is really the core of this whole genre. There's a reason the genre is named after it. What did Conan Doyle get right? Why was that the right place and the right time? And how was it that he was able, even with such amazing precursors as Jules Verne, why did it require someone like Conan Doyle to write this book at this particular time to bring the concept of the dinosaur novel and bring it of age?
Yeah. Oh, fantastic! I can't wait to that. There's a dinosaur resurgence. I'm feeling it. I feel like what with everything that's going on. Yeah, I feel like we're maybe entering a bit of a golden age for dinosaurs. And I was wondering how people can find you online if indeed you want them to.
So I definitely do not put the effort into, or I don't have the time to do the promotion that I used to, and I'm way down on my socials. However, if you're interested, I'm on Instagram at the.lost.valley, and I'm also on all usual podcasting platforms. Just look for The Lost Valley, and you'll find me. But bring a little something to drink, and
Yes.
be dressed for an expedition, just in case. You never know.
Amazing. I love I'm very jealous of all the books that you post on there. I'm a huge fan of like going to a secondhand bookshop and finding a book with an old illustration on there or something. And so, yeah, they're very inspirational images. I love it.
Lovely. Yeah. There's nothing better, is there?
No. Great. Well, I'll just say thank you very much for joining me, and yeah, safe travels.
Thanks very much, Roland. It's been good fun.
That was Cian Gill, and honestly, I could have stayed down in that cavern with him for a few more hours. If you enjoyed this conversation, and I can't imagine that you didn't, go and subscribe to the Lost Valley podcast right now. It's on all the usual platforms, and Cian's 2-part deep dive on Congo, both the Crichton novel and the gloriously daft film, is the perfect place to start. You can find him on Instagram at the.lost.valley, where he posts the kind of beautiful old illustrated editions that make me very jealous indeed. A few quick things from me. Everything we mentioned today, including the Malleson translation we read from, which is free in the public domain, plus that gloriously repetitive read-along tape music from my childhood, is linked in the show notes. And if you've got 30 seconds, a rating or review genuinely helps other deep time obsessives find the show. You can find us on Instagram at Jurassic Pirates Pod. Next time on Stones to Stories, we leave the centre of the earth and head for the Jurassic coast of England, because the sea dragons are waiting.
And it was just complete surprise when I was entombed in the snow. And I describe it as like being encased in a block of concrete. I remember thinking, yeah, if I can start with my hands and try and dig away. But I honestly couldn't even move. I couldn't even move the tips of my fingers or anything like that. So it did feel quite desperate. And then that's when I had that kind of emotion of surprise, and it was like, oh, this is how it's going to pan out for me.
Next time, I'll be joined by Matthew Myerscough, author of In Search of Sea Dragons, to talk ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs and all the wonderful Victorian fossil hunters that inspired him to get out his hammer on his incredible journey to recovery. Much more on that next time. If you like the big saurian battle today, you are going to love where we go next. Until then, keep your raft steady, keep your log up to date, and hopefully, the pirates don't eat the tourists.